Hello one, hello all. Welcome to the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast, the first and only podcast dedicated to the avenging adventuress of the Pulps, the Domino Lady. I'm your host, Sam Oatley. First of all, I really want to thank both oldcomers and newcomers who have clicked on this podcast. If you're an oldcomer who knows about the Domino Lady for several years or are familiar with her from the Pulp fandom, thank you very much for clicking, and I hope this keeps your interest and respects the character that you clearly have an interest in. And if you're a newcomer, I hope this episode and podcast will get you interested in this character because she really is fascinating, and I think you'll enjoy her as much as I do. In fact, this episode is really going to be a primer episode for anybody who is not terribly familiar with the Domino Lady as a character or her publication history. So, newcomers will hopefully be able to understand the character through my explanations. And if you're an old fan, hopefully this will be a nice refresher if you need it, or just a nice tread back on memory lane if you already know everything. But before I can really get into the Domino Lady's history and her publication background and all of that, I first have to talk about how this podcast really came about. Like a lot of things in our last few years, it all kind of started with the pandemic. Like a lot of us, I was stuck inside, and I was stuck inside in my college dormitory, and I didn't really have much to do other than computer work. So I decided to branch out and check out The Shadow, who I had heard about for years but never really focused on. So I read a few Shadow pulps and really liked him. I really liked Walter B. Gibson's writing style. And I was kind of looking into other pulp heroes who might catch my interest. And one of those heroes happened to be a heroine. In this case, the Domino Lady. And I read her description, I think it was on Wikipedia, and I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And I ordered some of her pulp stories in one of the pulp collections they made of her stories. And I actually really liked them when I finally read them. And I went and bought some of her later written works and comic books. And I just really enjoyed my time with the character. And I found that even as I joined some pulp groups and entered into a lot of the pulp fandom, there really wasn't a whole lot of discussion about the Domino Lady as a character. She was kind of just this historical footnote who, occasionally was trotted out to be talked about at like some of the pulp conventions and some history books about the pulps. And I thought that was kind of a shame because I think she's actually a lot more interesting than a lot of people give her credit for. So I'm a writer by nature, so I was initially thinking, oh, well, maybe I should write an article or a series of articles or even like a short book. I was kind of thinking initially in terms of like, if you're into The Shadow, you probably know about John Olson. He had this huge book that was reviewing like every single Shadow pulp story, as well as I think like the movie and some of his more like recent adventures from other authors. And that actually would have been easier for me because the Domino Lady doesn't have nearly as many stories as the Shadow. But I sort of sat and thought about it, and I was looking around the internet and seeing like how many podcasts were out there. Everybody knows about like Joe Rogan, and so I was kind of like, well, a podcast actually does kind of make sense because a lot of these stories are not terribly long, and you can actually talk a lot about them for, an hour-long episode or something in a way that maybe wouldn't be as natural if you were writing it down or doing an occasional article. So I sort of decided, all right, I want to do a podcast about the Domino Lady. And I decided this around, I would say, May 2021, which actually happened to be the 85th anniversary of the Domino Lady because she premiered in May 1936. Thus, I was really gung-ho on doing it, but around this time, one of my family members got really sick, and I kind of became her caretaker for a bit, and I didn't really have much time to do a podcast. So I put it on the back burner for about a year, and around March or April of last year, I was sort of thinking of starting it again. But that was right around when that family member passed away. And I had to do a lot of things like funeral preparations and affair settling. And that just kind of ate up my whole year of last year. And I just also wasn't really in an emotional state to do this podcast. It was just a rough time all around. And I didn't really come back to the idea of this podcast until I would say earlier this year, where I still had lots of things to do, but I was kind of like, well, I've been putting it off for almost 2 years. Maybe I should just do it, just because if I don't, I'll probably never do it. I've always kind of had a problem with procrastination. It's one of those things that I just need to fix, and the best way to fix it is to just do what you want. And so I was kind of on the fence about doing this for a few months until about, I would say 2 weeks ago, when Pulp Fest, which is the big pulp convention out in Pittsburgh, they released a video on their YouTube channel about the Domino Lady. They were actually releasing videos every few weeks about different pulp heroes, because Pulp Heroes is actually going to be one of their main themes for this year's Pulp Fest. So I kind of took that as a sign, and I was like, okay, this big pulp convention has mentioned her. I might as well just get on with it, because obviously somebody remembers her, and this might be just the time to hop on this train and get this podcast rolling. So I have, and I hope that this will be a fun experience for all of you and me. I also want to state unequivocally, because I'm guessing some of you have already guessed this, but the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast was inspired heavily by The Shadowcast, which is a podcast about the Shadow run by YouTube personality Razor Fist. And full disclosure, I have been subscribed to Razor Fist for years. I have been a huge fan of his Shadow videos, and I've been a huge fan of his Shadowcast. So I wanted to bring this up just because I think it's the right thing to do, partially. And two, because I just don't want to face any accusations of plagiarism or being a hack. Razorfist himself said in one of his videos, the line between plagiarism and inspiration is citation. So I wanted to cite the Shadowcast. I wanted to recommend anybody interested in the Shadowcast to go check it out. And I hope that this acknowledgement does not earn me a double middle finger and chair spin from Razor. So please do not sue me, Mr. Razor. I don't have as much money as the Shadow. So now I think it's best we just get into the Domino Lady herself, and I'll explain her background and basic character traits. Basically, the story of the Domino Lady is that she is this Los Angeles socialite named Ellen Patrick. She's pretty much a archetypical socialite party girl. Kind of that 1930s-esque dame who's always like hanging around at the parties and is upper crust and, sort of that blue blood type that existed back then. She's pretty much born with a silver spoon in her mouth because her father is the district attorney for Los Angeles and obviously has quite a bit of power and connections and sort of, he's a California politician. They weren't exactly known for being poor back then either. But that's actually not a fair comparison because in the Pulps itself, it stated that her father, whose name is Owen Patrick, he's actually a pretty tough DA, not really crooked, pretty fair but firm man. So obviously all the mobs and criminals hate him. And what happens is one year, Ellen Patrick graduates from the University of California, Berkeley, I believe. Yeah, it's Berkeley. But anyway, she graduates, and Owen sends her on like a worldwide trip because I guess it's the 1930s, it's the Depression, and if you've got money, things are really cheap. But anyway, while she's on this trip, Owen is murdered. By who? We don't know. The Pulps never really say. It's basically implied to be a mob hit, and nobody's really sure what the mob. It's kind of like pick your poison. Like every mob kind of was gunning for him. So obviously Ellen is quite upset by this. She sort of gets up in the middle of the trip, comes home to bury her father. And in case you don't know how superhero origin stories work, she decides, oh, well, they killed my father, so I'm going to avenge him. And she decides to avenge him in true pulp/comic book fashion by creating her own persona to fight crime. This persona is, of course, the Domino Lady. She gets this name because she wears a domino mask, kind of self-explanatory there. But the rest of her getup is interesting in its simplicity. It's essentially a tight white dress with no back. You have to be very specific. It's no back. Like the Pulps specify, no, there is no back on her dress. The dress is only held in the front by a thing that goes up her neck. I'll explain why that's important later on. And she also wears a black cape. Actually, technically, for a while, this was actually reversed. She actually had a black dress with a white cape for a while. But as I'll explain in future episodes of podcast, there was a reason that changed, or a suspected reason that changed. And the one most people will probably know about, if you know about the Domino Lady, will be the white dress and black cape. But anyway, with this black cape, white dress, black dress, white cape ensemble, whichever pulp story you happen to find yourself in, she decides she's going to go around and fight crime. And her tools are basically three things. One, a good old .22 pistol. Some writers in the modern day give her a .45, probably because they want a more impressive gun, because if you've ever held a .22 pistol, you know they're generally not these like .44 Magnum Dirty Harry kind of guns. They're kind of small. In the Pulps, it was generally a .22 pistol, for a reason I'll explain in a second. The second tool was this interesting little syringe that had knockout serum in it. It's never really said what the chemical is or anything like that. It's just knockout serum, and it's pretty much near instantaneous. Like, the second she pokes you and presses the plunger, you're out. Extremely quick acting. And the third tool she had, and this is where we get maybe some eyebrow raises, is her looks. Essentially, in case the pictures that I've shown have not demonstrated enough, Ellen Patrick is very beautiful. Unlike a lot of heroes who would like obscure their features or try to make a compact fighting gear that wouldn't, get in the way of battle, she actually very much draws attention to her looks. Like, her mask does not obscure her face aside from the top half. Her golden hair is on perfect display. The dress, as I'm sure you can see, is very form-fitting. You can very clearly tell the, shall we say, assets she is packing. And I'm not talking about the gun. But the Domino Lady is a looker, is what I'm saying. And this is actually very important later on. With these tools, Ellen decides to go around essentially being a sort of quasi-cat burglar who steals things from her targets, sometimes incriminating evidence, sometimes like blackmail stuff that they're holding on some of Elliot's friends, and sometimes just straight up like diamonds or jewels, valuable things. And every time she pulls one of these heists, she will leave a calling card that says, "Compliments of the Domino Lady." She's kind of a Robin Hood figure in that sense because she also donates all the proceeds, or at least most of the I should say most of the proceeds to charities, always anonymously, of course. And I say most because she does keep a cut because Ellen is a woman of certain tastes, you might say, some more expensive tastes than a small trust that her father left over could pay for. So essentially, she's living off her heists. This is actually one of the more interesting things about her that we'll get into later on in this podcast. Now, some of you who are more familiar with Pulp were probably listening to my description of how beautiful Ellen was and how revealing her dress was, and probably going, whoa, that seems kind of intense for a Pulp magazine. Because for those that don't know, Pulp magazines actually didn't have a whole lot of sexuality, at least initially, because a lot of the pulp publishers didn't want to receive the backlash from moral groups who were always looking for an excuse to come down on what they perceived as obscene material. So a lot of pulps kind of self-regulated their content, and even though a lot of them kind of got pretty violent, there actually wasn't a whole lot of sexuality. Will Murray had an essay about this in one of the Shadow reprints, where he brought up that there was a lot of time where Street and Smith, the publisher of the Shadow, would barely reference any women, and there was little to no implication of beauty or any sort of simmering sexuality in the Shadow stories. And it was just because of that policy of just, well, we don't want to offend the moral guardian, so let's not tread on any toes here. But the Domino Lady was somewhat different because the Domino Lady didn't come from a hero pulp or one of the more mainline pulps like Argosy or Blue Book. She came from the spicy pulps. Specifically, she came from Saucy Romantic Adventures, which, for those that don't know, spicy pulp magazines were essentially softcore pornography of their day. They were not ones that were particularly easy to get, because for starters, they were usually more expensive than a lot of the more mainline pulps. And two, they were never on open newsstands. Like, if you look at old pictures from the 30s and 40s and see all the pulp magazines lined up, you would not see Saucy Romantic Adventures or Spicy Western Tales or any of the spicy magazines. Because since they were considered softcore pornography, you had to go up to the newsstand owner or the bookkeeper and basically ask for it personally. They would pull it up from behind the desk, and presumably you were wearing a downturned hat and a trench coat while you were buying them. So the Domino Lady stories were not these easily accessible tales that you could pick up like you could with The Shadow or The Spider or Doc Savage. The spicy pulps were really kind of this taboo subject. You really couldn't talk about them much. And you didn't generally want to say, oh yeah, I've been reading the Spicies, because that would earn you some weird looks. You know, this wasn't like Playboy where you could say, oh, I was reading it for the articles. It's like, no, these were written generally for smut. And you were always kind of in an awkward position if you talked about how much you loved them. And it's interesting because the Spicies actually were not around that long in the basic history of pulp, because I think they first appeared in 1934, 1935, and they were only around till I think 1939, 1940, because essentially those aforementioned morality groups got a bugaboo about them, and they basically appeared for 5 years or so, and then went away. So not only did the Domino Lady not appear in that many stories, the very genre she was in was not around for terribly long, which is probably why her influence isn't nearly as noted or talked about as someone like, say, The Shadow or Doc Savage. Because, to put it bluntly, she really couldn't be much of an influence because the kids weren't reading her. The teenagers couldn't read her unless, they pinched one from their dad or something. The stories were not easily accessible, and the character herself was kind of a flash in the pan. She only appeared for 1 year, and not even that whole year. It's like, yeah, this was not a character who could have much of an impact compared to a lot of her pulp brethren, simply because she didn't really have the time to cause an impact. In fact, probably the most notable influence the Domino Lady had was on comic books, which should come as no surprise because anybody who knows about like The Shadow and Doc Savage know that Batman and Superman took a lot from them. And thus, a lot of the superheroines, particularly early era superheroines, took a little bit of influence from the Domino Lady herself. Particularly ones that were kind of the socialite, puts on a mask or a piece of clothing that obscures their features in a way that you can still tell they're beautiful, but you can't quite make them out fully. Their characters like Lady Luck, Miss Mask, the Veiled Avenger, Lady Satan, and probably the one that was most directly influenced, the Blonde Phantom. She was actually a pretty big character in the 40s, but again, kind of like the Domino Lady, she also sort of disappeared for a while. Thus, again, the character who was directly influenced by a Domino Lady really wasn't around much either, so it was kind of like, well, this influence isn't as obvious as a lot of the other pulp heroes' influence on comic books were. And even a lot of like cat burglar-esque characters like Catwoman or the Black Cat. I'm a Spider-Man fan, so I know a fair amount about the Black Cat. These characters also kind of took an influence from the Domino Lady, because there's some iterations of Catwoman where she was kind of wearing a dress and having a cape. She kind of had that big mask obscuring the top half of her face. And the Black Cat, you have this black and white ensemble, which is actually reflective of the Domino Lady's original costume. With that costume, you can sort of see how the Black Cat has kind of a similar design in that respect. And even a few years ago, there was a character named Madame Mirage by Paul Dini, who did Batman the Animated Series, who Dini said was more influenced by the Shadow because she does a bunch of illusions, like how the Radio Shadow could hypnotize people and make them not see him or see hallucinations. But even she kind of has a bit of the Domino Lady in her with like her white dress and facial obscuring veil. So, yeah, the Domino Lady's influence has been present even within the last few years. It's just not been as evident as a lot of the other pulp heroes. And one thing that is very different from the Domino Lady compared to all these comic book heroines that came after her was that the Domino Lady was actually not as action-packed as a lot of these other superheroines were. The Domino Lady was generally more about stealth and sneaking and thinking her way out of problems, compared to a lot of the more bang bang, pow pow, punch punch that a lot of these superheroines had later. And that makes sense because comic books were more of a visual medium and you had to have a little more action in there probably to attract a child audience or a younger audience. And it's a lot of these elements that I think make the Domino Lady so fascinating. Because this was a character who came from a very sleazy side of the pulps. She didn't come from that all-ages demographic a lot of the pulps were aiming for. She was very explicitly an adult character. She also had a lot of stories that were much more smaller scale. There were not these plans of world domination like Shiwan Khan had with the Shadow, or mad scientists going berserk. It was mostly these low-level stories of corruption and blackmail and jewels and just kind of more grounded sort of criminal enterprises. And that's actually kind of interesting compared to a lot of the more bombastic stories other pulps were doing. And the villains, too, were relatively grounded. There was one that was toward the end, I think it was like the fifth story, where they had this like black hooded cult called the Black Legion that was basically trying to take over California through weird machinations. But other than that, a lot of the bad guys in The Domino Lady were just kind of these grounded crime bosses and corrupt politicians. And really just sort of these, what you imagine a corrupt politician and criminal would be. Just these slovenly jerks who abuse their power. So these villains were kind of memorable in their unmemorability. They were kind of just like any other corrupt bastard you would see. And that's actually really interesting to me because it's a much more grounded take on pulp enemies than I think a lot of other pulps would have taken. And as I've mentioned before, the Domino Lady, at least in the original pulp stories, was a lot more focused on stealth and thinking her way out of problems than action. Like, there's not a lot of action. And I've heard some people criticize this element, but I think that's actually what makes it interesting because the story makes it clear that the Domino Lady probably could not slug her way out of a situation. She couldn't do the insane stunts of like The Shadow or Doc Savage because she's pretty much just an average woman who has a few tools she can use and doesn't have like the super strength of like Miss Fury or any of the bombastic superpowers that some of the later superheroines would have. And I think that's actually a really interesting idea of this character who might be in a little over her head and only has her wits and a couple of select tools to get out of a situation. And there's another thing that she has that I don't see a lot of people talk about, but is really interesting to me. The Domino Lady both kind of loves and hates her profession. Like, there's a lot of times in the pulps where she sort of reflects about how much she doesn't like having to do all this sneaking around, putting herself into danger. She'd rather just be a little socialite party girl for the rest of her life. But she feels this, not only this need to avenge her father, but she also gets kind of this thrill from robbing bad guys and causing chaos in the criminal world. And she's basically getting a thrill out of all of this. And it's kind of one of those things that you see some later comic book superheroes like Spider-Man and Daredevil, and I think even to a degree Miss Fury, where they kind of don't like being superheroes, and they're just kind of doing it because they feel sort of an obligation. You know, Spider-Man is with great power comes great responsibility. So the Domino Lady also has that to her character. But yeah, this tendency to both love and hate what she's doing is kind of interesting to me. And the pulps don't necessarily say it right out, but I think there's also kind of an economic motivation for her crimes. As I've said before, she keeps a cut of the loot that she steals to sort of fund her own taste. So there's kind of also an interesting element there. And remember, this is right in the middle of the Great Depression. So there's kind of an interesting implication there that she's possibly stealing just because she sort of needs it to fund her own tastes. So I've touched on it before, but to make it more clear here, the Domino Lady really is kind of obscure for a number of reasons. As I've said before, she didn't have that many appearances when she first premiered. Only 6 appearances within 1 year. 5 of them in saucy romantic adventures, and then 1 more in Mystery Adventure magazine. She was popular only in this one niche magazine that was in a niche magazine field of the Spiceys that not everybody would have been aware of at the time. Lars Anderson was not a known author, so nobody really had any frame of reference for what Lars Anderson was going for when he wrote these stories. It's not like Walter B. Gibson or Norvell Page, where we have lots of interviews and quotes from them talking about what they were going for. Like, no, we have no frame of reference for what Lars Anderson had in mind doing these stories. So there's really no creative background to the character that we can latch onto and really help guide what this character would do in later future stories. There's also the fact that for over 50 years, there was a relative disinterest from any major publishers about reprinting these stories, unlike The Shadow or Doc Savage, partially because of that stigma that it was softcore pornography, and thus you really probably wouldn't want to throw that on the shelves unless it was a specific kind of bookstore. Which is odd because these stories are actually not that explicit by today's standards. Hell, I'd argue they probably weren't that explicit by 70s and 80s standards. But yeah, most publishers probably weren't scurrying to republish what was considered softcore pornography of its day. So you didn't see reprints quite often by major publishers. And likewise, because there wasn't a whole lot of action compared to some of the superheroines that were inspired by the Domino Lady, you don't really have a big market for this cat burglar-esque thing. And because of all these combined issues with having an X-rated character from an X-rated magazine and the magazine itself being pretty niche, you really don't get a lot of outside media of the Domino Lady in her own time. And even decades after the fact, you don't get a lot of outside media about her. Which wasn't the case with, say, The Shadow or Doc Savage or The Spider, who had like film serials and radio shows and movies. So the Domino Lady just didn't have any outside recognizance from her pulp stories, which were already pretty obscure to begin with. And the last factor that really made her obscure is the fact that she went into the public domain. That's partially because she was so obscure, because nobody really knew much about her, so she just kind of quietly entered the public domain in the 60s. And even then, nobody really did anything with her till like 25 years later. Like, this is a character who just doesn't have a whole lot of stories behind her, and is kind of overshadowed by a lot of the more action-packed superheroines that came after her, or even before her. Like Pat Savage was more action-packed than the Domino Lady was in a lot of her adventures. So it was just this perfect storm of factors that just left the Domino Lady relatively obscure. It wasn't really until the 1980s, I would say, where pulp fanzines really started to take off, and people started actually reprinting the Domino Lady stories, generally more as like single stories, but also there were occasionally ones that reprinted all of the stories. And it's there that you start to see a bit more of a comeback for her, because in 1990 there was a comic book miniseries by Fantagraphics that was, like the Spiceys, basically softcore pornography, and used the Domino Lady because she was public domain by that point and was a pulp heroine with some gravitas at the time in pulp circles. And that one kind of came and went with little fanfare. And it's not really until 2004 when Bold Venture Press decided to reprint the entire 6 original stories that we see a bit more attention come her way. Around 2009, that's when Moonstone Books, who has really been the one that's done the most with the Domino Lady, appeared and did a new literary collection of Domino Lady stories that were brand new. Some of them crossovers with other pulp characters like the Black Bat and the Phantom. And that same year, they also released a comic book series that went for 5 issues and basically reintroduced the character to the comic books. But even this brief resurgence has kind of fallen to the wayside, because there were 3 major publishers who were still doing stories with the Domino Lady: Moonstone Books, Bold Venture Press, and Airship 27. And over the last few years, all three of them have kind of waned in terms of their output of the Domino Lady stories. Moonstone, after the initial comic book series, kind of turned the Domino Lady into a crossover queen, where they basically just sort of trotted her out to do crossovers and nothing much else. They did occasional stories that were just her, but they were kind of these one-offs that were kind of just one stories in collection, or they were in like the backlog of magazines like the Phantom, KGB, and they just really didn't do much. In fact, they've actually been pushing a new character called Domino Patrick, who is the daughter of the Domino Lady, and is basically a Honey West pastiche. And they've really been pushing her over the last year or so more than the Domino Lady herself. And they just don't seem to have figured out what to do with the character in terms of single stories. And it's really a shame because they were the ones that really did help push her comeback in 2009. And Bold Venture Press really hasn't done much with her. They had one story that they were putting out in their Pulp Adventures magazine, or no, their my mistake, Awesome Tales magazine, and they did this one big crossover, I think, with a Black Bat called like Battle Beyond, but they just really haven't done much with her in the recent years, and I don't know what's going on with that. Airship 27 is the only one that's been relatively consistent in putting out Domino Lady material, but they only kind of do it like every 2 or 3 years. They'll publish one collection of like 4 or 5 stories, but it's pretty staggered through like 2 or 3 years. So it's consistent, but it's pretty spaced. And that's kind of a downer. So that's actually another reason why I'm starting this podcast, because I think this lack of activity is a bummer. She's a character who really could be used more often and more creatively. And I hope that this podcast may help in bringing more attention to her so that either these 3 publishers who have done something with her or somebody new who wants to do something with her can get enough attention and love that they could actually do a successful Domino Lady story or radio show or comic book or anything like that. And for that reason, Suitors of the Domino Lady is going to be monthly, partially because I want to keep encouraging people to keep remembering the Domino Lady. And also, as I mentioned before, I'm a bit of a procrastinator, so I want to have a set schedule so that I keep putting out stuff consistently and have to actually commit to something. And the order for this podcast will essentially be chronological order. I'm going to do the stories in the order that they were written and created, mostly because a lot of the Domino Lady stories are done pretty much in order of each other, and it's just sort of an easy way to attack it compared to something like The Shadow or Doc Savage, which has hundreds of stories and outside media that you can pretty much approach any way you want. The Domino Lady doesn't have that much freedom in terms of what was created for the character, so going in chronological order just makes the most sense. I also want to state the main goal for this podcast, because going back to the Shadowcast that I mentioned, Razorfist has a pretty definitive style where he talks about the stories and will review certain media, and I will be doing that too. I do plan on reviewing and discussing Domino Lady stories, but I'm also planning on doing a little more interactive things. I want to talk more with others and see what they like about the character, what they think should be done to the character. And a lot of this podcast is going to be discussing possibilities you could do with the Domino Lady in the future, because she is a character that I think can have a future return to grace. It just needs the right approach, and I kind of want to discuss either talking to myself like this or talking with another person who has worked with the Domino Lady or wants to work with her and see what happens. So this first season of the Domino Lady will take place through the rest of this year, from May to December of this year. And we are going to focus purely on her first pulp appearances. I'm planning to do each of her stories from Saucy Romantic Adventures and Mystery Adventure Magazine. I'm going to release an episode in the month each of her stories were originally released. So, like, the Domino Lady Collects was the first story, and that premiered in May. So I'm going to do another episode this May, focusing on that story. The Domino Lady Doubles Back was released in June, so I'm going to do an episode on it in June. And it's going to continue like that through the rest of the year. And there will be 2 episodes where I'll have to decide what to do because they don't have a pulp story connected to them. But I'll figure that out in the time that comes. This is also something I'm kind of pinching from Razor Fist because he just finished the season where he talked about like the first 10 shadow pulp stories. But I kind of have to pinch that idea because there's really no way to approach the Domino Lady without attacking each of her stories chronologically. Because one thing, I forgot to mention this, but there actually is kind of an overarching story to the first 5 Domino Lady stories. It's not an overt story, but there is kind of an overarching one. So you really can't approach them without doing them in that order. I also think it's important to examine these first few Domino Lady stories because they really do guide impressions of how she's like in later stories by authors several decades later. And it's actually important to read these to sort of get an idea of how her character is like, and basically letting those guide your impression of the character in comparison to what later writers and artists do with her. And once we move on to next year, the stories will follow roughly chronological order from that point onward because it's the easiest way to approach them. So I'm going to sign off now. I hope that this podcast has piqued your interest in the Domino Lady if you didn't really know about her much before. And I hope if you already knew about the Domino Lady and liked her, this will keep you around, and we'll be able to discuss the Domino Lady more in depth in the coming months. There will be another episode this month, probably in the last weekend of May, where we discuss the Domino Lady Collects, the very first Domino Lady pulp story. This episode was originally meant to come out in late April, but there were some recording issues and I didn't quite have it fully edited before April, and there was just a lot of things happening for me then, so I was like, okay, release this one late and just do the Domino Lady Collects episode later in the month. Hopefully you guys won't mind 2 episodes in a month, but just don't expect that to be a constant throughout the rest of this podcast. I also want to plug 2 groups that discuss the Shadow, partially because I'm a big Shadow fan and these 2 groups are big influences on me. The first is the obvious Shadowcast by Razor Fist. I'm leaving a link for that in the description because it's an awesome podcast if you like the Shadow. And if you don't know about the Shadow, you should go and check that out because Razor does a great job of breaking it down. The second group is the Shadowed Circle group, which I am plugging shamelessly because I am their web manager. So it's a publication that focuses on non-fictional articles about the Shadow and various histories about him and background. It's a very interesting publication if you're into the Shadow, so I highly recommend you check that out. I am leaving the links to our website and Facebook page in the description as well, and I highly recommend you check us out if you are interested in the Shadow. I also have a bunch of media links for the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast. One will be the Facebook page, and the other will be our Twitter page. Please check those out if you want updates to this podcast. So once again, thank you very much to all who have listened. I'll see you again later this month. And good night to all of you suitors of the Domino Lady.